Welcome to the program Leaders Cultivating a Flourishing World. I'm so happy that you all are watching this episode because we will talk about a very important topic for the society with an expert from the UK. Today, we are very honored to have with us Dr. Liz Gulliford. Dr. Liz Gulliford, she works at the School of Education of the University of Birmingham at the United Kingdom at the Jubilee Center for Character and Virtues. I have the honor of meeting Dr. Gulliford last summer when I had the opportunity visiting Birmingham and visiting the center, and it was a great experience for me to learn more from them. I have admired this center for many years, the great work they do, and it was a beautiful visit to the university. Thank you so much, Dr. Gulliford, for receiving me that time.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Thank you so much. So I would like to have an introduction of the expertise of Dr. Gulliford. She is an associate professor at the School of Education in the University of Birmingham at the United Kingdom. Liz PhD established a firm critical foundation for theoretical and practical work in positive psychology, positive education, and character education. Beautiful and very important topics nowadays in education for the well-being of the world. She has carried out extensive conceptual and empirical work in the following domains: publishing in a range of journals in psychology, education, and philosophy about gratitude, forgiveness, hope, and optimism, courage, compassion, virtue ethics, moral development, positive psychology, theories of well-being, positive education, character education, exemplarist moral theory. I love all these topics, and I believe researching and teaching about this topic make the world a better place. So I admire so much the work Dr. Liz Gulliford is doing. Also, she participated in a project with John Templeton on the role of exemplar narratives in cultivating character. And she has given numerous invited presentations internationally to both academic and lay audiences. Also, Dr. Liz, she published 4 children's books on forgiveness, gratitude, courage, and hope. And later on, we will talk about this important publication. So welcome, Dr. Gulliford, to this program where we like to interview colleagues on the topics for the well-being of the society. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So now we would like to start with some important questions. Liz, you have carried out extensive conceptual and empirical work in very important fields, publishing in various journals. So I would like to ask you first, how do you describe positive psychology?
Okay, so positive psychology has sort of come about really since around the year 2000, give or take a year or two. And really what positive psychology foregrounds is an emphasis on well-being and an emphasis on cultivating positive emotions and strengths of character. Now, in a way, this is quite sort of corrective to the psychology that had preceded it, which had mostly had a focus on fixing what was wrong with people. Now, that wasn't, how it was, absolutely. There were instances where psychologists had taken a more kind of positive look at the human person and human capabilities, things like humanistic psychology, for example, and self-actualization, which of course was a part of humanistic psychologies. But for the most part, the emphasis, I think, in psychology tended to be, on how you could address what might be wrong with people. And I think that the important thing about positive psychology was it was a way of trying to kind of highlight that there's a lot right with people as well. We're not perfect, but actually we do have these strengths of character, and they actually make us who we are. And even in the midst of, great suffering and the trials that we face as part of our lives, we can still draw on these strengths of character. So it was a powerful thing, I think, when positive psychology started to look at how people could develop these strengths. And of course, this chimes in with virtue ethics, with a lot of what's happened in kind of philosophy as well. But the emphasis, as I said, wasn't just on developing these strengths, it's also on promoting and building, if you like, positive emotions as well. And so there are certain strategies within positive psychology that aim to increase well-being by means of kind of boosting so-called positive emotions. Now, when I say so-called, that's because all emotions are important, and we need a balance, obviously. We need to feel the whole range of our emotions. So by talking about boosting positive emotions, that's not to kind of get rid, as if we ever could, of the negative emotions in our lives, but ways that we can kind of savour our success, for example, ways that we can kind of lengthen positive experiences that we have. And these are all kind of part of the repertoire, if you like, of positive psychology. So I think, there are lots of different people who are within kind of positive psychology, and I would kind of define myself, I think, as a critical positive psychologist. I take a lot of positive psychology, but at the same time, I think we need to kind of be careful that we don't move too far away from what you might want to describe as the kind of more challenging side of life. But I think it is the truth that even that we're not kind of enclosed within the adverse experiences that we have, and that, as Maya Angelou said, the caged bird can sink. So actually, I think it's important to emphasize that there are these kind of bursts of light and potentiality when we look at human strengths that we perhaps didn't even realize that we had. And I think that's a really important part of positive psychology.
Great, thank you so much. Also, what does positive education means to you?
Well, that's quite simple, because that really is the application of positive psychological principles in educational settings. So having just described what positive psychology is, although, as I say, different people might have different definitions, the application of those principles of how we can build positive emotions and how we can build strengths of character, that is really what positive education is, the application of that. And so, because it's education, it would be looking at how we can do that in primary education, in secondary education, in tertiary education. There's quite a lot of work now that's being done on, looking at applying positive education in universities and so on. So yes, it would encompass things like ways of promoting well-being by perhaps enhancing gratitude, enhancing optimism, strategies to help young people to become more resilient. These would all be kind of part of positive education. And also ways of building these strengths and virtues, or these excellencies of character that we all have. So that that would be what kind of positive education is. Yeah.
Great. I was going to ask you. So, what is character education?
So character education overlaps, I think, with positive education. But I think it focuses more on cultivating these virtues or excellences, strengths of character, whatever you want to call them, than well-being per se. So whilst the emphasis in a lot of positive psychology could be on increasing young people's happiness or helping them to be maybe less prone to depression in later life and so on. These are important outcomes, but I think the goal of character education is not so much a salutary one, so much as a moral one. So it's more about promoting those strengths of character in their own right, not necessarily because promoting those strengths of character is good for people's well-being. I mean, that it could be, but that's maybe an indirect effect. So whilst they overlap, that kind of sustained focus on cultivating character is obviously more in the ascendant, I think, in character education. But I think they share a lot of common ground.
Yeah.
Yeah.
These are related topics: positive psychology, positive education, character education. And I would like to know, on your story, how did you become interested in learning, researching, teaching about these important topics for education and for the good of the society, Liz?
Okay, so a bit of biography, is that what you would like? My
Yeah.
story.
So,
Okay.
how did you get interested in this? Why you have dedicated a lot of years' effort on doing this?
Yeah, well, I think, to be honest, I always was interested in it. I think it came from within. But my first degree was a theology degree. And while I was doing that, I kind of did a psychology of religion component within that. I was at Oxford University in the 1990s, and we had to study biblical studies, New Testament Greek. We looked at doctrine. But there were a few things that we could select, and I selected to do something on the psychology of religion. And I became particularly interested in some of these psychological questions. So the relationship between religion and mental health, for example, was something I was interested in. And one of the topics that I was profoundly interested in really was the topic of forgiveness. Now, obviously, forgiveness is central to the world's religions, including Christianity. And whilst forgiveness is often kind of upheld as an ethical ideal, there isn't much about how to help people to forgive or how you can help yourself to forgive. You know, what are the psychological processes that people go through when they either receive forgiveness themselves or they try to forgive somebody else. And so I felt that it was important to kind of elucidate this. I mean, we all need to be forgiven. We all need to forgive. This is the human condition, that nobody's perfect. So, you know, forgiveness is pretty important. And I felt it was a neglected area, you know, just how people can go about the task of forgiving other people or of accepting forgiveness themselves. And so I kind of transitioned into psychology at this point. I did a master's in psychology and religion at Cambridge, at Queen's College, Cambridge. And then after that, finished that, I did a second undergraduate degree, a Bachelor of Science, in this case, in psychology. But my dissertation for the master's had been on, it's an MPhil, had been on forgiveness, on theological and psychological aspects of forgiveness. And so what then happened was that it came to my PhD, and by this point I'd got the psychology background as well, and I wanted to look at how, and it began with the forgiveness in the MPhil, looking at theological and psychological aspects of it. But because in around about 2000, positive psychology had come on the scene, and it was starting to shine a light on strengths of character, at this point, I thought, well, actually, I could widen this out. And in my PhD, I could take an interdisciplinary approach to examining more virtues, not just forgiveness. And so that's what I did. And so I looked at forgiveness, gratitude, courage, and hope in my PhD. And I looked at how they were understood within positive psychology and how they were construed theologically as well. So it was an interdisciplinary approach. And I also looked more broadly at positive psychology as a kind of a phenomenon and what it was telling people about the nature of human personhood and the nature of human fulfillment as well. And so that's how I kind of moved into the virtues and looked beyond forgiveness, which was the first topic that I'd examined, which obviously came out of that theology background.
Yeah.
And then in 2012, a job was advertised at the newly opened Jubilee Centre for Character and Virtues. And I thought at the time it was a research fellowship that they wanted to fill several research fellowship roles. And of course, they specifically wanted to recruit people who had some background in virtue and character. And so I applied. In July of that year, I was interviewed, and then I got the job. And since then, I've turned my focus to other virtues as well, to humility, to compassion, to phronesis. In other words, phronesis being practical wisdom. One of the things about the Jubilee Centre is that it has an Aristotelian or neo-Aristotelian approach to character education. And so practical wisdom, or phronesis, as Aristotle called it, is a very important aspect of that. So that's how I kind of moved from 1994 to 2012.
Wow.
And then, of course, you know, that's the bigger picture. But I think, to be honest, I was always interested in what it means to be a good person. And obviously that does incorporate the idea of what strengths we admire in people who we identify as good. So I think it was always within to come out this way. You know,
Yeah, I think once we start researching and learning about all these topics, we fall in love on the topics, and we cannot stop researching and making other questions and trying to learn more. No?
Yeah, that's right.
Because helping people to flourish, I think, is a beautiful goal in education and main objective of teaching any subject. So these topics, positive psychology, positive education, character education, etc., are essential topics to help people to flourish. And now I want to ask you, so what is your point of view on how can a person develop a virtuous character? That's the challenge in life.
Well, it is. But like so many things in life, really, it's a question of practice, isn't it? Practice makes perfect. So if you want to be more virtuous, you've got to be committed to aspiration and to trying to cultivate that virtue.
So the
I think
person will be committed to practice a virtue.
Well, I think that you can't be half-hearted about it. You know, you've got to mean it. If you want to develop a virtue, whatever that is, it's not going to happen accidentally. You know, you need to invest some time in that. Now, how does that manifest? I mean, I think one of the things is to learn more about, you know, what the virtues are, in a sense. I mean, you know, if actually somebody wants to become more virtuous, it kind of makes sense to look at examples of people, you know, exemplars of people who've embodied that virtue, and maybe also to read some of the literature around what that virtue is. I mean, sometimes there can be misunderstandings, and I think there's always room for debate, but a lot of people, I think that forgiveness has something to do with forgetting. we have this adage in English, forgive and forget. This is unhelpful because it's not possible to forget wrongs of a very serious nature. I mean, minor infractions, yeah, you might forget that in the course of a day, but when somebody's wronged you in a major way, you're simply not going to be capable of forgetting that. I mean, it would require some sort of amnesia. And so I think sometimes these popular definitions of virtues, or, you know, not definitions, but adages, popular wisdom, actually isn't helpful. So I think sometimes part of growing in virtue might be to understand more about what it means. And I think another example is something like humility, where people may have a wrong idea perhaps about what humility is. They think it might mean some kind of self-abasement, which, you know, I don't actually think a proper sense of humility does require this sort of negative view of oneself. There isn't time to go into that now, but my point is this. You want to learn more about what the virtues are, what they mean, and you want to promote it in ways that are age appropriate as well, which of course is what I tried to do in those books. Yeah. As I said, you can learn from exemplars, people who've embodied those virtues, and obviously that may inspire you to emulate those people's virtues. Another way we can become more virtuous as well is to enact behaviours and sort of rituals and practices that help us to become more virtuous. So, for example, you could keep a gratitude journal, and that, you know, somebody in the course of your day, you can think about what's happened and what you're grateful for, who provided that benefit, and you can actually sort of essentially kind of reflect on all of the things that you've received that day in a kind of a grateful light. And obviously that helps you then to be more attuned for seeing opportunities to be grateful the next day. In a way, it primes you psychologically. I mean, I can speak from experience here. I don't keep a gratitude journal all the time, but when I have tried to take my own medicine, things happen during the day, somebody does something kind for you, and you think, oh, I'll write that down in the journal later. And it creates a kind of, instead of a vicious cycle, we've all heard of vicious cycles, it creates a kind of a virtuous cycle, which is of course the opposite, that you're thinking about, you know, things that you're grateful for, and it creates that kind of attention towards gratitude that perhaps you may have taken things for granted before, but it attunes you and it makes you attend more to opportunities for gratitude in your life, things that people have done, you know, that have been kind. And of course, another thing you can do is you can reflect more broadly on experiences of virtue and vice. You can reflect on how you've negotiated things in the day. So rather than having a specific journal dedicated to a particular virtue, you can simply do more reflection on where you have fallen short, maybe, or you know, what you learned about virtue that day from somebody else, and you commit that into a journal as well. But I think the key thing is the more you invest, the more you reap, you know. So essentially, sow more virtue, reap more virtue, and I think that's the message, really.
Yes, and I love your term of virtue cycle. And I think we should be aware and be conscious, as you say, about our day, what was virtue action, virtuous action, and what virtues we practice today. How can we be a better person? And think about that instead of thinking about negative things, no?
Well, yes, I mean, but I think also, you know, we grow by thinking of our shortcomings as well. So maybe some vices will make it into our reflections. You know, when we might have been a bit intemperate, could we have counted to 10, or could we have counted to 100 before we responded to somebody? Could we have been more prudent? You know, so I think it's important to learn both from our kind of better moments, that's encouraging for us. But at the same time, obviously, there's a lot to be learned from, where we've fallen short as well. Yeah.
Yeah. In the past, there was an advertising in Mexico in the TV that trying to promote good values in the family, saying count to 10 before you shout or you say something.
Well, it's interesting because I recently read a book, which is on the table over there, and it was about how the founding fathers of America, actually, some of them, like Benjamin Franklin, is described in the book as having kept, and Washington, I think, copied this as well, a sort of a daily table of virtues and vices, and whether they'd actually enacted that virtue that day, or people were actually kind of taking the trouble to kind of reflect on their on virtue in a very self-conscious way, which I think we can learn a lot from. The book's by Jeffrey Rosen. It's called The Pursuit of Happiness. It's an interesting book because it's about how those founding fathers of America actually tried, to bring about happiness in terms of not so much feeling good, but doing good through virtuous actions, and that's why they wanted to make themselves accountable, for their own behaviour. And so I don't think. I think maybe people are slightly afraid these days that there's something very moralistic about it, but actually it's more about growth as a person. And as you ask the question, how can you become more virtuous? And it's by paying more attention to being virtuous. I mean, attention is the gateway to everything.
Yeah, and now you mentioned the founding fathers. When I give a workshop to professors or teachers of parents, I make them to create a monument of a good teacher they had in their lives, and they create like a heart or a tree or something. And I see the monuments in the cities for the heroes in the countries. It's because they practice good qualities, positive traits, virtues in a very important way. That's where they have the statue in the country about them, no? And as you say, is practicing and making these beautiful values as forgiveness, as being brave, etc., turn them in actions. So I want to ask you also, as we know, virtue education is vitally important for the well-being and flourishing of the society. So you have published children's books on forgiveness, gratitude, courage, and hope, such important virtues. I would like to ask you some questions on these topics, Liz.
Yes, of course, yeah.
So please, could you explain how these virtues can be fostered at home or at school?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing, I mean, I've already touched on this a little bit, it is promoting the virtues in a very kind of educational way. So you actually need to help young people to understand what these virtues are. So what we would call virtue literacy, if you like. So what is gratitude? What is forgiveness, hope, courage, compassion, humility? Whatever the virtue is. That's the essential kind of, first step, I think. And as I said earlier on, sometimes people have a view of these virtues that might be inhibiting them from cultivating them. For example, if somebody's not religious, they think forgiveness is a religious virtue. Perhaps to help people understand it's not religious. I mean, it is for some people. But it doesn't have to be, and forgiveness is a human process. And I think it's important sometimes to kind of help people, whatever age they are, to understand what the virtues are, what they're aiming for, first of all. So that kind of first step, but it does have to be age appropriate. On that note, the reason I chose these 4 virtues links back to what I was telling you earlier on about my PhD. I felt that it was important to try to get across some of the central things that I had covered in my PhD, some of the central points, in a way that 8 to 12-year-old children would understand. And so actually the format in these books is a story, and the story, if you like, has moments where there might be some kind of moral question. So in the forgiveness book, for example, there's a number of questions around forgiveness, but one of them includes someone who's bullied another child. And then there's the whole question of whether you should forgive a bully. That question isn't resolved, but it's, if you like, an ethical dilemma that's embedded within the storyline. And then there are other questions, that are kind of embedded in a story format. And then at the end of the book, each of those books, there are some kind of central points about each of those virtues. I can say more on each one in a minute, but points for educators and parents, where there's some sort of key learning points, and key kind of questions of different, for example, types of courage, what forgiveness is, what it isn't, what hoping requires of us. You can't just hope, emptily. It's not just positive thinking, wishful thinking. What does hope commit us to? And that's discussed, in relation to young people's achievements. You can't just hope with your fingers crossed. You need to kind of, take action to some extent as well. So each of those books, has these sort of questions at the end for parents and other educators, and it has a summary of kind of main points as well. And yeah, the idea is that young people kind of engage in the story, and then they can kind of discuss whether they think characters in the story did the right thing, or what would they have done, and to kind of promote discussion in a way. So this is going back to the question of how we promote virtue. First of all, we might want young people to understand what virtues are, but then we might want to engage in a dialogue to help them to reflect on what those virtues look like in practice. And that's the aim in those books, to stimulate this kind of reflection and discussion in an age-appropriate way, and not on their own, but with their peers and maybe with their parents or teachers and so on.
For what range of ages do you recommend these books?
Well, I thought, obviously there's a lot of developmental difference, isn't there, in young people, but I think about 8 to 12, obviously the younger children might need more intervention from the adults in reading the book and asking the questions. The older children probably could read the book for themselves and then maybe engage with the questions and the reflections at the end.
Those ages are essential, are very important, because kids are in elementary school or middle school, and it's very important to be very strong in these virtues. And I would like to ask you, for example, on forgiveness, how can one forgive a serious offense?
Well, I think it's important to just stress that the question of whether forgiveness is always appropriate is something that we always need to bear in mind. Like the bully in the book, there is this question in the forgiveness book of whether a child should forgive another child who's intimidated him and bullied him in the school. If you forgive that, might that encourage the bully to behave badly towards other people as well? Now, these are questions we always have to have in our minds. And of course, when we use this book, there is advice at the end about any disclosures that young people might make, because we wouldn't necessarily want to promote the view that forgiveness is always good. If children have been exploited, for example, by older people or even by other children, these issues need to be explored. So there's a question about what's being forgiven here, what and whether you might want to seek help for children from other sources in the school. So I think I'm just making that point that we need to be aware that some young people might be going through some very difficult situations at home, and the question is whether forgiveness is appropriate. But let's say that actually we're talking about adults here, and the adult does want to forgive someone who may have abused them, for example, in the past. There are different ways that we can help people to forgive psychologically, if that's what they want to do. One of the ways is by perhaps helping people to think differently about what might have led the person to behave the way they did. So in a sense, this is kind of a cognitive reframing approach, a different perspective on the offender. What factors in their life, proximal and distal factors, back in their childhood or more recently where they're going through stress, what factors might help us to kind of loosen in a way the kind of bonds of resentment we might feel towards them, and maybe we learn something about that person that helps us to see them in a different light. But again, there's a caveat here, because to condone a behaviour, to say, well, anybody would have behaved like that if they'd had this childhood, or if they had been going through stress. I mean, we know that's not the case. So sometimes when we do this kind of exercise of reframing, which is what Bob Enright talks about, the psychologist Bob Enright, there's a point, it may be helpful, but obviously it depends on the severity of the offence, whether we can do that. And of course, forgiveness is a process. That's one of the things I talk about in the book, in the children's book. It's not just instantaneous. It may take a long time. So we might find ourselves being able to forgive someone by this kind of more cognitive approach of looking at somebody not just as a big bad wolf, but as a wounded individual, what might have led them to kind of behave the way they did. There are other strategies, that we might use to help people to forgive. We might take the approach that are feeling empathy for them, which is what Lev Worthington talks about in his model of forgiveness. So how must the offender be feeling now? They must be feeling terrible that they've done this, and to try to kind of feel compassion for the offender, and to realise at the same time that sometimes we may have hurt other people, and in a sense we're in some ways similar to the person who's offended against us. But of course, again, there is the caveat then that you might not be able to empathise with someone who's done something truly horrific, and then also the question of whether there's a parity between wrongdoing, which of course there isn't. If you look at yourself and you say, well, I'm not without fault myself, that's of course true. But I mean, if what you're looking to forgive is something really heinous, then obviously that person's transgression, if let's say it was a murder or something of someone close to you, thinking about, well, I'm not perfect myself. I mean, there's a huge gulf between what you might have done wrong and what someone might have done to you. So I think that there are points where I think thinking about somebody differently or trying to cultivate empathy for someone can be helpful, but it's not necessarily easy to do that. And obviously a lot depends on the severity of the offence. But there are some strategies that psychologists have put forward which might help people to forgive others. And of course, if that's what you want to do, then it's a good idea to try these out, and to see how you get on with them.
And forgiving helps the people who forgives also a lot, because you are free of resentment and burden in your life, no?
Maybe not free of it entirely. I mean, because obviously memory will kind of bring things back to you.
Yeah.
So then it may not kind of be extinguished forever. That's just human nature. reflect back. But it could be helpful, and you know, there's this Chinese proverb, isn't there? He who seeks revenge must dig two graves. That actually, you know, potentially, if you don't forgive, you know, it could be hurtful to you. But at the end of the day, it obviously is someone's decision, you know, whether they think forgiveness is appropriate or not. I mean, I think we wouldn't want to coerce people into forgiving someone who had, you know, behaved very badly towards them.
Yeah. Also, I would like to talk briefly about gratitude. So, what do you see are the benefits of practicing gratitude, Liz?
Okay, well, I think it's important to say this at the start, that the main benefit of practicing gratitude is that you become a more grateful person. Right? Now, that may seem obvious, but actually the reason I say it is because a lot of the research that's been carried out in positive psychology on gratitude has looked at the instrumental benefits of gratitude. So if you keep a gratitude journal, for example, or if you write a gratitude letter, or if you engage in various kind of gratitude-related behaviours, then you will become happier, less depressed, more socially connected. There's some evidence to suggest you sleep better. There's some evidence to suggest that people might take fewer painkillers, have better self-esteem, etc. Now, I don't want to minimise that those are all worthwhile ends, right? But obviously, if we're interested in cultivating gratitude as a virtue, our primary focus should be on not necessarily what kind of instrumental benefits might come from practicing gratitude. So I've mentioned some of the things that gratitude might do for people, and I think that's important. Some of them are social benefits, you know, the social connection. It's obvious why that is, because obviously you're thinking about who's benefited you and how you can hopefully benefit other people in the future. Maybe the same people, or maybe you can pay it forward to other people. But I think sometimes there's a risk when we focus too much on these instrumental benefits of actually kind of moving away from the virtue of gratitude, what gratitude requires of us, and the focus on the benefactor, you know, recognizing their goodness in conferring the benefit, rather than, if you like, capitalizing on the good feeling for our own benefit. So to put it simply, I think the benefits of practicing gratitude are manifold, but one thing to bear in mind is that primarily, you know, we would practice gratitude to honor our benefactors. And if we start kind of moving to goals like being happier or sleeping better or whatever, that's moving away from what gratitude requires of us in response, the action that gratitude requires, either in helping other people, service to other people, some kind of reciprocation. I mean, we might not be able to, you know, exactly kind of reciprocate to our benefactors. They might have died, or we might not be in contact with them. But there's something about, you know, the grateful response that means that we're thinking of how we can honour that person's goodness. And if all we're thinking about is feeling better ourselves, then actually something's slightly run aground.
Thank you. And about courage, what do you think are signs that someone is practicing courage?
Well, actually, it's an interesting question, but I think probably people having a go at doing things, feeling the fear and doing it anyway. You know, Susan Jeffers, that kind of thing. Expanding beyond our comfort zone, perhaps, because of course courage isn't the absence of fear. So, you know, we would still expect people to feel some kind of fear or anxiety about something, but perhaps, you know, wanting to, you know, by increments, perhaps overcome that fear, whatever it may be. So I suppose that's That's what I'd say about that. But of course, if we were educating it in young people, as per the Courage book, which you already were discussing, one of the things I talk about in there is we want to cultivate courage that is practically wise. I don't use that terminology, but we don't want children to not appraise the risks of things. So that would just be foolhardiness. Obviously, Aristotle would say that that would be a vice of deficiency. If somebody was foolhardy, you've got to be able to kind of estimate a vice of excess. You've got to be able to appraise the risks adequately. And if you're foolhardy, then obviously you're not doing that. So in the story, that there is that kind of aspect that to teach young people that actually it's not just about taking uncalculated risks. You've got to be prudent as well.
Yeah, we know virtues are connected, and if you practice courage, you have to be prudent, and you have to be honest, and all the virtues.
Well, that's right. I mean, obviously, Aristotle would say that the virtues are kind of unified. In practical wisdom, that would be his view.
Yes.
But I certainly take the view that virtues are related to each other.
Yeah,
I think that's that.
I have another question. Finally, how can we instill hope in children?
Well,
because nowadays, Liz, many kids and many young people and adults, they are suffering depression, loss of purpose, anxiety, because many reasons. But I think hope is very important to overcome all these feelings too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, hope is very, very important. But I mean, one thing that I want to bring out, and I talk about this in both the book about courage and the book about hope, and is that we're not on our own in hoping, or in we are encouraged by other people, right? So these virtues, we participate in them, and other people can kindle hope in us when we might not have any hope of our own. Other people encourage us. So the children, and adults as well, but we're not just thrust on our own resources. We're often inspired by other people to hope, when perhaps we might be feeling hopeless ourselves. I mean, if you think, people go to see a therapist in the hope that that person will kindle hope in them. This tells you that hope is shared between people. It isn't just a property of individuals. Now, of course, there are aspects of hope that are under our control. And it's a key thing, I think, that the confidence that inspires hope comes from different things, right? So, people could be hopeful about, young people could be hopeful about their attainment in an exam, partly because they prepared for it. As I said earlier on, it's not enough to hope emptily, to just sort of positive think your way through things. There are aspects of preparation that would give you confidence, and the confidence you have would be grounded in your own preparation. But as I say, there are other things you can do that could maybe help you to be more optimistic or hopeful, which are really how you think about the situation. And so you can teach young people to question their beliefs somewhat, some cognitive behavioural therapy. For example, you can have young people reflect on, and this is what young people are asked to do in the Penn Resilience Programme, which is kind of to promote, optimism, is you can have them, if they're reflecting on things they failed in the past, and this is helping, this is harming their sort of approach to exam preparation in the future, for example, you can examine whether the young people, attribute the cause of their failure to something that, will always be the case. I failed at this time, I always will fail things. or, to think, I failed this, everything I ever do, will go wrong. So I think some of hope is about challenging some of the implicit beliefs that young people might have. So instead of thinking the problem is permanent, I'll always be like this, we can help to kind of scaffold young people to be thinking about and questioning, whether that belief is something that they need to work with, and actually to think, well, maybe I made a mistake in that last exam, but that doesn't mean to say that every time I do an exam, I'll always fail. That kind of belief, obviously self-limiting, isn't it? And you can kindle some hope potentially in people by getting them to think differently. Similarly, if people think everything they ever do ends in failure, then you could point out things that they do well, as if you were a teacher or a parent, to challenge that belief that there's always pervasively something going to go wrong. So I think there are ways we can help young people to think differently about the future. But one thing that I think is important to bear in mind is that some of the anxieties that we experience in life are existential. That we're always going to have them. We need to manage them throughout our life, and it's part of the human condition sometimes to feel overwhelmed, and I don't think sometimes equipping people with these strategies can help, but it won't completely eradicate our anxiety, because I think that's a certain amount of it, at least, if it's not pathological, is to be expected in negotiating the challenges the world throws before us.
Thank you. And I would like to ask you, what will be your reflection or message to educators, to parents in the world, so we can help in the best way the kids and the youth to flourish, Liz?
Well, I mean, I think we have to educate ourselves as to some of the strategies that can help to promote these virtues in young people, to know what the virtues are, what ways there are of building them. And I think, we need to point to examples of the virtues, not just, famous people, but people in the lives of us all, and I think we also need to be realistic that this isn't a transformation that's going to happen overnight. This is a lifelong endeavor, and we won't always get it right, and we won't always behave perfectly, but that it's part of a commitment to grow and to do better in the future.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so grateful with you that we had this opportunity to talk about such important topics as positive psychology, positive education, character education, topics I love and I'm passionate for many years. I also did my thesis and dissertation about these topics, and I believe we all should promote and learn more strategies to integrate this everywhere, in the family, in the schools, in the governments, in the society, because we want a better society and a better world full of virtues, full of positive character traits, and a flourishing world. And I was so excited to have the opportunity of visiting, as I said at the beginning of the program, the University of Birmingham and the Jubilee Center for Character and Virtue, and interacting with you in that visit. I'm so grateful, Liz, and please send my regards to all the Jubilee Center of Character Education. And thank you so much for your kindness and for your time for this interview.
Oh, you're very welcome. Very welcome. Yeah.
And
you know, I enjoyed showing you around Birmingham and around the centre. You know, I've enjoyed our conversation today. So thank you.
thank you so much. And I want to thank all the audience for being with us today and invite all to practice virtues like hope, gratitude, and friendship, and responsibility, love, etc. Because those virtues will help us to build a better society and flourishing lives, flourishing families, flourishing schools, and a flourishing world. Thank you so much, and see you next time.